Reporting. Northern Ireland has been praised for the way it manages more than 1,100 sex offenders living in the community. Independent inspectors say a system of supervision introduced 3 years ago is now viewed as a model to be copied.
This week, BBC Newsline is featuring a series of special reports on how we deal with registered offenders. Some experts believe they can be rehabilitated.
Others, including many of their victims, say they should be locked up and the keys should be thrown away.
Of the convicted sex offenders who have served their sentences and are now living in the community, the vast majority are classified as Category 1. That means it's thought highly unlikely they'll re-offend. In this category, there are over 1,000 living in the community.
Category 2 means there is a clear and identifiable risk of re-offending. There are over 100 in this category.
Category 3 means it's thought highly likely further offences will occur. There are 2 of these offenders living in the community.
To start our series, our Home Affairs correspondent Vincent Kearney has been speaking to the wife of an offender who found out after 20 years of marriage that her husband had abused a young family member. She decided to stay with him.
We've called the woman Anne to protect her identity. She says the horrible secret only came out when the victim challenged her husband in a letter.
The day he got the letter, that's the day I found out. He told me right away. He thought, or what he said was, that if she had the courage to write the letter and took that courage, he should have the courage himself to actually admit to what he had done. I had no indication at all of anything untoward going on. You find that hard to believe, and people did find it hard to believe that you wouldn't know something was amiss, but I knew nothing. It was just a complete shock.
And did your husband remain in the house throughout this time, or what happened there?
Well, he stayed in the house and I actually left. So I did. I was away for probably about 1.5 years. We were split. It was such a shock. I was angry, didn't know what, and I was in between my family, him, I had to get away just to get some space, really, trying to get my, head around it. What he did was a really bad thing. It's not the whole person. We'd had a very good marriage for 25 years. He was very good to me. He was not a violent person, so he had a lot of good points. So I wanted to try and get my head around and understand it.
And what about your husband then? Just tell me how long, in terms of his sentence, how long did he spend in jail, and what happened to your husband then? He
would have got 6.5 years, so he would unserved 3.25 of those there in McGilligan. And while he was there, then he went through the sex offenders programme, which he found very good, very educational, very hard for him, but he needed to address, and he wanted to address what he had done, and try to understand, come to terms with it.
And did you notice much of a change in your husband at all in prison during the treatment process?
It made him have to deal with what had happened, what he had done, and see the damage that he had caused, and I suppose he would have been in denial to begin with, before he would have went in, and it was only when he would have been in there and actually went on to the sex offenders programme that he would have actually understood better and would have been a bit more not understanding of what it's hard to say, but that had a really good positive effect on him.
And what about the critical issue of trust? Do you find it now that after what you've gone through, given that big lie that you were told that night, can you still fully trust your husband?
Can I fully trust him? Yes, I think I can say that now. I couldn't have said it, a couple of years ago, but I do think that I can trust him. So I do. Knowing him the way I do, and him being such an honest person, I don't think that he is ever going to do that again. So he's not, I just know that he's not.
What would you say to those who might say, look, once a sex offender, always a sex offender, you can't change?
No, that's not. People don't understand. They just have a blanket view of what, if you're labelled a sex offender, that's it. That's, close the door. You've done that one thing, and that's the only thing that you'll always be like that there. But you're not, a sex offender for the rest of your life. Right? I don't think that. at all.
Well, Anne's husband is visited by a probation worker on a regular basis, and she's confident, as she says, that he won't reoffend. On tomorrow's BBC Newsline, we'll hear from a forensic psychologist who says treatment programmes do work and reduce the risk of reoffending.
A high-flying civil servant.
Efforts to rehabilitate sex offenders provoke much debate. Experts who work with them say treatment can work, but others, including many of the victims, say the only way to deal with them is to lock them up for good.
In the second part of our series this week on the management of sex offenders, we look at the treatment process. Not all convicted sex offenders are ordered to undergo treatment programmes as part of their sentence, but all are encouraged to take part.
Treatment starts soon after they go into prison and continues after release, depending on the level of risk they pose. Our Home Affairs correspondent Vincent Kearney reports.
There are currently 170 convicted sex offenders within the prison system in Northern Ireland. This is where treatment programmes aimed at reducing the likelihood of them reoffending begin. Shortly after arriving in prison, sex offenders are assessed to determine the level of treatment required and the timescale for delivery.
So they will attend programmes like the Sex Offender Treatment Programme, which is a 9-month programme and quite an intensive cognitive programme, actually designed to look at the cognitive thinking behind prisoners committing the like of sex offences or violent offences. And it's about improving the way people think and approach their thought processes.
An inspection report published yesterday said the prison service needs to increase the number of programmes it provides. After serving their sentence and being released, offenders are assessed again to determine the level of risk they pose. The level of risk determines the level of treatment and monitoring required. And the forensic psychologist with the probation board believes this treatment process works.
The rate of reoffending for sex offenders is relatively low. Now that is a cold comfort to any victim, and the impact of sexual offending on any victim, victim's family and indeed the community is significant, and we recognise that. But we know that if they go through treatment programmes, sex offenders are 3 times less likely to reoffend than those that are not treated on a programme.
This victim of sexual abuse says her personal experience has made her sceptical about the success of treatment programmes. Her words are spoken by someone else to protect her identity.
Every abuser that I know, they don't want to get help. They con and work the system. I just feel that in Northern Ireland we don't have enough resources to monitor them. I do feel there is more done for the perpetrator than the abuse victim.
She's not alone. Those who work with victims of sex abuse say her views are widely shared.
Well, understandably, you know, their mood swings between sheer terror and sheer anger, and, you know, I suppose understandably their feelings is that they should be locked up and the key thrown away, basically. And you can understand those feelings given the amount of damage that these people do to their lives.
I think longer sentences would be more appropriate. I am aware that there is a very small minority that do choose to get rehabilitation and to get help, but there are many abusers out there who choose not to get the help and who choose to continue the abuse.
However, those who run the programmes not only say there's clear evidence that they work, but there are also penalties for those deemed suitable for treatment who refuse to take part.
If the individual is not prepared to engage in treatment once they have been assessed and found suitable for treatment, if they refuse to engage in treatment, we can, through the courts, actually breach them and return them ultimately to prison.
More than 30 sex offenders have been sent back to prison since January last year for breaching conditions imposed by the courts. Vincent Kearney, BBC Newsline.
For tomorrow's report, we have been given exclusive access to a meeting where the risk posed by a sex offender is discussed, and we'll also examine the controversial issue of housing sex offenders in the community. To Dublin next, where 2 Garda witnesses assault. For some people, housing sex offenders in the community after prison is a recipe for disaster. But the agencies who work with them say it helps reduce the risk of reoffending. For the latest in our series of reports on the management of sex offenders, our Home Affairs correspondent Vincent Kearney has been given unprecedented access into a normally private meeting where government agencies discuss the risk posed by an offender and how to deal with it.
There are more than 1,100 registered sex offenders living in the community after they've served their prison sentence. The police and agencies who work with them say that's the best way to reduce the risk of reoffending.
Assessing the risk posed by a sex offender and how best to manage that risk is discussed by a local area public protection panel. More than 20 of these meetings take place across Northern Ireland every month. The one taking place here today is attended by representatives from the police, probation board, housing executive, social services and a lay advisor, here to represent the views of the public. This is the first time television cameras have ever been allowed to film such a meeting.
The name of the offender being discussed has been changed to protect his identity.
Mr Black has been managed within the public protection arrangements for the past 3 years, having been sentenced at court for sexual offences against a female child who was known to him. The prohibitions contained in that order are as follows. You must have no unsupervised contact with a child without social services approval, and you must not enter into a relationship without informing the designated risk manager. So the police currently undertake the designated risk manager role in this case.
Up until recently, Mr Black has been engaging well. However, within the last few days, and yesterday in particular, a number of issues have actually come to my attention. The first one is that Mr Black may have commenced a relationship with a young woman, and she may actually be a single mum. When I went to call with Mr Black yesterday, he wasn't there. He wasn't at his registered address.
And obviously the information that we've got from the police today is a cause for concern. Social services have not given Mr Black approval to have any unsupervised contact with any child or children.
Jerry, just moving on to the other concern really about housing, can you clarify what the current position is?
Mr Black has applied for housing. Right. He applied on the 21st of April 2011. And his application has been assessed and has been placed on our list.
There are a number of concerns with regard to potential relationship, potential child victim access.
Like in the case of Mr Black, where sex offenders live is a crucial part of risk management. It's also one of the most controversial because parents don't want a convicted sex offender living near their families.
And I'm a parent of 2 young boys myself. I entirely understand the raw emotion that comes around this debate as well. But actually the issue of housing cuts to the nub of the challenge for the public protection arrangement in Northern Ireland, because it's a balance between us as professionals, public protection professionals, knowing where the offender lives and having them live in an environment where we can effectively manage the risk that they pose against having them live somewhere where it's more difficult to actually make that assessment and manage that risk.
The murder of 8-year-old Sarah Payne by a convicted sex offender in Sussex 11 years ago led to a new law in England and Wales allowing parents to check if someone with access to their children is a child sex offender, but it's unlikely to be introduced here.
The environment in Northern Ireland still, sadly, is different in that we have a number of people who are out actively shooting people who they think are involved in this type of behaviour.
The murder of Atracta Haran 8 years ago demonstrated that the risk of reoffending can never be fully removed. Her killer, convicted rapist Trevor Hamilton, had been released from prison weeks earlier. He was regarded as such a high risk, he was supposed to be the most closely monitored sex offender here at that time. The agencies managing sex offenders accept that risk can't be completely removed, but insist that housing offenders in the community helps to reduce it. Vincent Kearney, BBC Newsline.
And on tomorrow's programme we continue this series with the experiences of a victim of a sex offender.
If you were looking out to Newsline. Here on BBC Newsline this week we've been looking at issues surrounding sex offenders, the debate over rehabilitation and living back in the community. This evening we talk to a victim. Our Home Affairs correspondent Vincent Kearney has been listening to the harrowing story of a woman who was sexually abused from the age of 5.
I was a very shy sort of child and didn't really excel or anything at school, but was quite withdrawn. I did have friends, I'm not saying I didn't have friends, and I did take part in things out in the street, playing the normal children's games, but I was always thinking and analysing and wondering when it would happen again, when would I be abused again. A few things did help me in that when I started to be abused, I was at a different school, and my parents did move me school because I wasn't sort of projecting myself in the class, and they were worried. They thought it was the teacher. I wasn't happy with the teacher, and they moved school. And actually that was a good thing, in that moving school meant he didn't have access to me as regularly as he had done before. But obviously he was asked to babysit now and again, and there have been the times I'd be abused again.
And clearly from what you said, you didn't feel confident enough as a child to actually tell your parents or tell anyone else?
No, to be honest, at that point when you're a child, you don't necessarily know what's happening to you. I think when I was 9, and this is why it stopped really, was a cousin of mine told me how you make babies, this is how you make babies, and that's when the penny dropped what he was doing to me. So the next time that he was abusing me, I said to him, I know this is how you make babies. And I don't remember, but I know through a grapevine back that he said that I had threatened to tell my father. And that's when the abuse stopped. That's when he didn't come anywhere near me. If I came into the house, he left. And that probably went on for a couple of years until I obviously didn't tell my father. It was obviously a very difficult situation, and I had to sort of analyse that as a 9-year-old to say what sort of impact would I have, sort of blowing this and making it known to the wider family. And to be honest, at that point, and as a 9-year-old, I decided obviously not to. But it did scar me. I can't deny that. Growing up, turning 13, developing into a woman was the most traumatic time of my life. All those things that you don't want to be actually feminine. Dressed like a boy, sort of covered it up. I think by the age of sort of 18, when I went to university and sort of grounded myself, and I realised that I was in control. He was in a sense afraid of me, yet I would have met him at gatherings and everything, and he would have talked to me and I would have talked to him, but I knew looking into his eyes and he knew looking into mine, we know each other's secret here, and dare step out of line sort of thing. Whether I would have disclosed at that point, probably wasn't ready to. Obviously wasn't ready to, because I didn't.
What you were saying earlier, you clearly feel that in many ways you lost your childhood.
Absolutely, it was gone. I didn't grow up. I became an adult at 9 really, when I realised what had happened to me. But I believe I've survived the whole process and I've come out the other end.
And on tomorrow's programme, we'll hear from those who work with victims and abusers.
It's Father's Day on Sunday, and for this week's Family Focus Newsline.
All this week we've been looking at the issue of sex offenders and how to reduce the risk they pose after being released from prison.
In the final part of our series, our Home Affairs correspondent Vincent Kearney talks to people who work with offenders and to victims.
Working with the victims of sexual abuse and the abusers is a job most people would rather leave to others.
The initial offence.
Tara Swan is a police officer and a mother of one. She's been working with sex offenders and their victims for 10 years. Claire McRoberts is a mother of 3 and leads a team of probation officers who work with offenders.
Staff choose to come into this area of work. It's not something they're forced to do, it's something they choose to do because they believe that they can, under their operational guidance from their organisation, make a difference.
I think it's one of the areas where you actually feel that you can make an impact and you can actually make a difference to people's lives.
They're responsible for monitoring and supervising sex offenders deemed to pose a risk to the community after being released from prison. That means talking to the abused and the abusers on a regular basis.
The assessments are very detailed assessments, and you have to actually ask about someone's intimate thoughts, intimate sexual behaviours in fact, as well as their offending. And you don't just do that once, you do that every visit. So it's incredibly challenging on an emotional level. And we're members of the community too. We're mums, we're dads, we're mothers, we're fathers.
While we know that the reconviction rate of sex offenders is relatively low, Any statistic means that someone has been hurt and seriously harmed, and at a human level that has got to impact on us, but we use that to increase our resolve to make a difference.
It's inevitable that there are cases that you will hear and that you will deal with during the day, that you do and you will always carry with you, because there are such human thoughts around some of the victimisation that has happened that you can't help but actually relate to that victim, to your own circumstances.
Vincent Kearney ending that series on the treatment of sex offenders in the community. Now, golf, Rory McIlroy